Today we celebrate the solemnity of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It is a very great feast, and basically what we're celebrating is, we could say, the triumph of Our Lady, but also her glorification. So she enters into heaven not just in her soul, but body and soul. And of course, she is deserving of this because of her participation in making salvation possible for us by her yes to the angel Gabriel at the very beginning of the God's plan of salvation for us, of God's plan for Christ to enter into our world, but also because of her participation as she suffered with Christ when she stood at the foot of the cross and throughout his entire passion. So for all of these things, she deserves this honor, this great glory, this great glorification. But we could also add that, if you think of the relationship between a son and a mother, it's ideally a good relationship, but especially when you have the perfect son and the perfect mother, wouldn't their love be extremely great? And wouldn't the son, who's able to do this for his mother, want to do this for her mother? Well, of course he would. So we could say that's another reason also. And when we consider, the Old Testament times, there were other individuals who were taken up body and soul. For example, the prophets Enoch and Elijah. And if God would do that for them, how much more would he do it for someone like Our Lady? So it makes perfect sense that this would happen. So we kind of rejoice in the fact that Our Lady receives this glory both in body and soul, that she is taken up, she's assumed into heaven to the right hand of Christ, or to be with her divine Son. We can imagine their union in heaven, not just in their souls, but also in their bodies. And when we think of this glorification of Mary, we participate in this, right? We rejoice in this. We kind of honor Our Lady. We add to the glorification by our love, by our honoring of her. And some non-Catholic Christians, they say, well, why do you Catholics, you have such devotion to Our Lady? Why do you spend so much time focused on Our Lady? Well, the reality is that, yes, she is a great part of our tradition, a great part of our faith, but it's not that our focus on her takes away from our focus on God, or our understanding that God is the one who is the source of all goodness, including the goodness that is present in Our Lady. So everything that we do regarding Our Lady is directed ultimately towards God, towards honoring God, because as she said in her Magnificat, God has done great things in those who are lowly. So she was very lowly, and God did great things in her. So when we look at the lives of the saints, we shouldn't marvel so much at what the great things that the saints did, but rather what God did in the saints and through the saints was able to accomplish great things. So everything is ultimately from God, and we ultimately honor God. So the reason we as Catholics, we honor Our Lady so much is because God honors her so much. Her divine Son honors her so much that he would assume her into heaven and crown her as the Queen of heaven. And in fact, this is even scriptural. So when she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, as we heard in today's gospel reading, notice what Elizabeth says. Why is this that the mother of my Lord should come to me? So in other words, what she's saying is, I am not worthy to have you, the mother of my Lord, come to me. But you see, the Jewish tradition is you would always honor the elders. So Mary would honor her cousin Elizabeth, and Elizabeth would understand that this honor is due her because she's older than Mary. But Elizabeth recognizes that Mary is with child, and it's not just any child, but she is the mother of her Lord. And so so Elizabeth honors Mary, and Mary in her Magnificat, points out that all generations will call her blessed. And as I mentioned before, it's really only us Catholics, we could include the Orthodox also, that we honor Mary on a regular basis. The non-Catholic Christians, they might acknowledge that, yes, Mary is an honored individual, but we honor her regularly. It's not, we don't just acknowledge it, we actually honor her. We actively honor her as when we celebrate her great feast days. And in fact, even in the readings that we have, Our Lady is honored. In the first reading from the book of Revelation, it starts off by talking about the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the Ark of the Covenant, if you remember, it had the stones from the Ten Commandments, some of the manna, and the staff of Aaron, and it was the place where God was most present. But you see, the Ark of the Covenant was a foreshadowing of Mary. So Mary is the true Ark of the Covenant, and the reading goes on to point that out, that there's this woman who's clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Well, obviously she's being honored. If she's crowned with 12 stars, it's God who's honoring her in this way. And then it goes on to talk about her son, and it's clear that it's a reference to Christ. And this image of the lady in the book of Revelation, or the woman, does refer to Mary. It also refers to the church, but Mary is a model of the church. And then in today's second reading from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, it talks about how Christ is the first fruits, right? So Christ is the first to resurrect, and he is the one who ascends to heaven. But Mary, we could say, follows after Christ. So in other words, what Christ obtained for all of us and what he's going to do for all of us at the end of time, he already applies that to Mary. And we could say, in anticipation of the merits of Christ, that Enoch and Elijah in Old Testament times were taken up body and soul. They didn't actually enter into heaven because the gates of heaven had not yet been opened, but they would have ascended into limbo, both body and soul. So Christ applies the fruits of his merits to Our Lady in its fullness. And we could also add, there's speculation in regards to Saint Joseph, that nobody has found his tomb. In other words, it would have been important to know where the parents of Jesus are buried. But there is no tomb of St. Joseph that is found. So the assumption is that he too, at some point, was resurrected and assumed into heaven. Or perhaps right after his death, he may have been assumed or taken up just like Enoch and Elijah were. So these first fruits are applied to certain individuals, such as Mary. And all of these things, yes, they honor Mary, they glorify Our Lady, and it's a reminder to us that we should glorify her also. But one of the other reasons as to why we spend so much time honoring Our Lady and having such devotion to Our Lady, and all these Marian apparitions also, which is God's reminder to us to honor her, the reason we do all these things is because Mary is the one who is closest to her divine Son. And she is the one who has the greatest influence on her divine Son. In other words, she is our greatest intercessor. And because she is our greatest intercessor, we ought to honor her. And the other thing which is worth mentioning is Satan fears Mary more than he fears God. And I mentioned this before, and it's not because Mary is greater than God. She's just a lowly, humble handmaid of the Lord. But she, Mary, crushes the head of the serpent. So once again, going back to Scripture, Genesis 3:15, where God addresses the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. And she will crush your head, and you will strike at his heel. So Mary crushes the head of the serpent. So Satan was not able to tempt Mary, he was not able to overcome God's plan in regards to what Mary, begins the process of our salvation by her yes to God. And so she has such power over Satan. And so Satan and the evil spirits, they fear Mary more than they fear God. The analogy I give, of Hulk Hogan, you guys might remember Hulk Hogan, this big, huge wrestler, right? If I was put into the ring against Hulk Hogan, well, I'm going to lose. I'm not going to be humiliated. I'm going to lose because it's expected that he's going to beat me. But I might put in a few good punches, put on a good show. But if I was put into the ring with a little 3-year-old girl and she beats me, I'm going to be totally humiliated. And Satan is full of pride. The evil spirits are full of pride. They cannot stand to be humiliated. They cannot stand to be beaten. And so Mary has conquered Satan. Mary has beaten Satan. Yes, through the grace of God. So ultimately it's Christ who conquers Satan, but by her cooperation, she participates in that. So Satan fears Mary more than anyone else. Now, when we think of Mary, it's really interesting that we honor her, God honors her and crowns her with the crown of 12 stars in heaven. But what exactly did Mary do? I just mentioned a lot of what she just did. And everything she did was very, very important. But if you think about it, she had a child. And she suffered because of her child. She suffered with her child. Yes, she conceived immaculately. She was conceived immaculately, but she conceived her Christ child miraculously, yes. But the whole point is, what she did, every woman, in some sense, is capable of. But the secret of Mary is her humility and her obedience to God. So Mary's obedience undoes Eve's disobedience, or at least begins the process of undoing Eve's disobedience. So the whole point is that if we are like Mary, insofar as we are obedient to God, then God will do great things in us, and God will exalt us, not to the same degree of glory as Mary certainly. But yes, this is what it means to be lowly, to be humble, not to trust in ourselves, not to give in to pride, not to think that we know it all, but to submit to God's will, not just obeying his commandments, but seeking his will in our lives. God, what do you want me to do in this situation? What do you want me to do in that situation? Being obedient to God. This is the key to our success. This is the key for us to receive an abundance of God's blessings and graces, and for us not just to attain to heaven, but to attain to a high degree of glory in heaven.